everybody for joining us. The Indiana Thoroughbred Alliance is a group of thoroughbred racehorse breeders, owners, trainers, and enthusiasts who are dedicated to supporting the industry in the state of Indiana and throughout the Midwest. They're dedicated to supporting education and furthering any opportunity that they can for those interested in the thoroughbred racing industry. I am going to give it up to Dr. Brown-Douglas. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A and the chat. We are working on getting the live streaming going on the Facebook page. So I will give it up to Clarissa. Thank you so much.
Obviously, with the thoroughbred industry demanding large horses, is this scientifically correct in terms of what goes through the yearling sale? We know that when horses are chosen to be purchased, it's often very subjective with what a trainer or a purchaser might like. So we were very interested in looking at the data to see if size influenced sales price and future racing performance. So we crunched a lot of the numbers that we had from Kentucky yearlings going through the Keeneland sale and found some really interesting results, possibly not unsurprising results though. We knew that the sale price of a yearling was influenced by their size when they were measured as yearlings. Yearlings that sold above the session median for the session that they went through the ring were heavier and taller than those that sold below the session median. And obviously those that sold versus those that didn't sell were heavier and taller. Interestingly, we then went on to follow these horses through on the racetrack to see whether the size as yearlings influenced how they performed. And so we had about 4,000 horses in this data set. And we found that elite performers, those that were stakes winners, graded stakes winners, Group 1 winners, and millionaires were bigger and taller as yearlings. We found that tall but moderately heavy young horses were most likely to become successful athletes. So it wasn't the absolute giants in the group. However, smaller yearlings were not necessarily bad. Horses that started as 2-year-olds were smaller than those that didn't as a yearling. Smaller horses as yearlings had more career starts. They were likely to run earlier and for longer, which does indicate some level of soundness and a smaller skeleton to fill out, so they matured more rapidly. However, those that were very, very small as yearlings, lower than a quarter of the population in weight, had fewer stakes winners in that group and lower earnings. And this doesn't necessarily mean an earlier born foal, because of course with percentiles, we've taken that noise out of the equation, and it was exactly when they were 360 days, measured at 360 days. This is just one particular graph that came out of that study. The bars, the grey bars along the bottom, show the yearlings divided up into weight quartiles. So the fourth quartile is a quarter of that population as yearlings that were the most heaviest. The first quartile were the quarter of the population that were the lightest. And you can see here the bars represent the median sales price. So at the yearling sales, obviously the horses that were the most heaviest as yearlings were the most, commanded the biggest price at sale. However, when we went on to look at their racing results, you can see the percentage of stakes winners, which is the line graph. There was no difference in the percentage of stakes winners in those groups when they were racing, except the smallest group. So the smallest quartile, those were the smallest when they were yearlings, had the fewer stakes winners than those who were slightly bigger in the population. There's an awful lot more information, obviously, in that study. So I invite you to look at our website for the full details, and of course, ask questions if you'd like that data sent to you. So when we're looking at growing these young horses, how can we influence how big they are at the sales to ensure that they become sound athletes? Well, let's have a look at some numbers. When horses are born, they're approximately 10% of their mature weight. A little bit different depending on the breeds. The heavier horses or drafts tend to be a wee bit smaller, ponies a little bit bigger. One interesting fact is that when they're born, they only have about 17% of their mature bone mineral content. So there's an awful lot of skeleton that needs to grow and mature once they're on the ground. We know that there's quite a lot of link between the broodmare and the foal size. bigger mares have bigger foals. Mares that are between the ages of 7 and 11, and those that have foaled before also have bigger foals. We know that colts are bigger than fillies. That's global. We know that. And we know that foals born earlier in the season generally are smaller than those born later in the season, except for those very, very extremely late ones. So the growth period between foal and weaning is a really period of rapid growth. There's a lot of skeleton growth, a lot of body condition put on. We know by 5 weeks of age, the foal has doubled its birth weight, and their average daily gain around this time is around 1 kilo or 2 pounds per day. At around 6 months of age, they've about 40% of their mature weight, 80% of their height. And we do know that the month that they were born does have an effect on how they were growing. We know that foals born in the winter months, so for you guys, January, February foals, they're born smaller than those born in the spring. And we know that winter-born foals then actually catch up and grow more rapidly. They gain more weight at about 3 months of age. And so this was confirmed in a study that, again, we did in central Kentucky, looking at brood mares and foals' body weights and conditions in the first 5 months of life. This particular graph shows average daily gain of foals born from January through to May at 7 days, 30 days, and then monthly from there. The major points that I'd like you to focus on are that the winter-born foals, those born in January and February, had less weight gain in the first month of birth, but then out at 3 months of age, they gained more body weight. They caught up when that spring pasture flush came in. So there are some issues with these early born foals. Obviously, age-wise, we do want to have foals born early in the season to maximize the growth period between birth and the sales, should you be selling them at a sales. However, there are some problems. January and February born foals are known to have a greater incidence of fetlock OCDs than those born later in the season. And this is possibly due to inadequate bone formation, because when they're born, particularly in climates such as yours in Indiana and in northern areas of the USA, it's much, much colder than a lot of other climates in the winter months. And so these horses are either out on the snow with limited turnout, or they're housed in stables. And so it's thought that these early born foals born in the winter months are housed with limited access, which causes limited bone development. And then, of course, they go through some compensatory growth at 3 months of age. They gain a lot of condition with that spring pasture flush, and that causes excess weight on growing joints. So another issue with birth month is that early born foals don't necessarily perform better than the later born foals. And in fact, with our data that we looked at earlier, there was a greater percentage of 2-year-old starters born later in the season, and a greater percentage of stakes winners were born in March, interestingly, in that data set. That's not necessarily statistically with the whole population of the world, but that was an interesting fact. So the period from weaning to yearling is a really interesting period looking at growth. We do know that when horses grow, it's a function of season, nutrition, and genetics. Weaning can obviously have a huge impact on growth, particularly if it's related to a stressful time, if it's not done properly. Often these horses can see a check in their growth, their average daily gain drops off. Obviously, also this is occurring in the early winter months, so there might be a nutritional issue there. Their average daily gain naturally decreases through the winter months and then increases again in the spring, in correlation with an increase in pasture growth and quality, and also the onset of puberty, which occurs during that first spring of life. So at 12 months of age, a yearling will be about 60% of mature weight and nearly their mature height, 92% of mature height. When we looked at the growth rate of thoroughbreds, so again, average daily gain of thoroughbred populations around the world, interestingly, they all followed this very similar curve. Early average daily gains are about 2 pounds per day, or 1.5 kilos per day, dropping to a low of about 0.5 kilo or 1 pound per day in the winter months, and then an increase in the spring. And I think, interestingly, on this particular data set, thoroughbreds that we measured in India did not show that spring pasture flush because their climate's quite different to the other thoroughbred growing regions of the world. So obviously nutrition is really important for the growing horse. They're future equine athletes, so we need to provide them with the substrates to grow really strong skeletons and mature properly. So during that young phase of growth, minerals are being deposited in the bone, and if we have poor mineral and nutrient intake, we get a poor skeleton, horses break down, they end up with shin splints, and it's not great. It's also really important to get the nutrition of your young horses correct, because any nutrition mistakes made early on in their growth can result in reduced performance potential later on. Sometimes you can't play catch up, but there are different strategies for different age groups. And it all starts with the mother. If we go back looking at how the fetal foal develops in utero, you can see here that it's not a linear growth curve. So the first 7 months of gestation, that young growing foal is very, very small. It's only about 2% or less than 2% of the mare's weight when it's at 7 months in utero. But there is a period of rapid growth in the last 4 to 5 months of gestation. And this not only is a rapid growth in size of the young horse, but it's really critical for bone and cartilage development. And this is because this young growing foal within its mother's belly will store very important minerals for bone and cartilage development in its liver for use once it's born. And we know that zinc, manganese, iron, and copper are very, very important to be stored in the young horse's liver during this time. So it's vital that the brood mare is provided with adequate nutrition so that the foal can store these for use once it's born. Once the foal is hopefully safely on the ground, we know that provided the mare is producing great milk, nursing will provide 100% of what that baby needs in terms of protein, energy, and some of those macro minerals. But remember, a lot of those trace minerals come from what it received when it was in utero. Provided mares are milking well, foals will be drinking often up to 15 to 20 kilograms of milk per day, so an awful lot when they're first born. We do know that very early on they do start to eat solid food. They mimic what the mare does. They'll nibble on hay and grain, they'll nibble on pasture. And at 5 or actually nearly 3 months of age, they're eating 50% of their time is spent grazing and eating. And so they learn from their mums. And it's important, obviously, leading up to weaning, that they're well used to eating a concentrate feed, because that's what they'll be relying on through the winter. One of the main questions we get asked is when to introduce a concentrate feed to our young horses. When should we begin feeding? We know that if the mare's milking well, it's their primary energy source. But as the foal grows and as lactation continues, we do see that there's a divergence in these curves. So the energy that the foal requires increases, and what the mare's milk provides decreases. And this happens at about 2 to 3 months of age. So it's important then that at about 60 to 90 days, the foal will need to be on some level of concentrate feed. A lot of thoroughbred breeders will utilize creep feeding with their foals, and this is where you provide a nutrient-dense concentrate feed to a foal that's nursing, separating it from its mother, or at least preventing the mother from eating the feed and just allowing the foal to get it. And this is often a strategy that a lot of thoroughbred farms will use. And there's advantages with providing quality protein and energy for these foals, particularly if we're unsure about whether the mare's producing enough milk. It does get them on a higher plane of nutrition, so you increase the growth rate, and it's good in preparation for weaning. Once the foal's weaned, this is a really critical point for ensuring that the horse doesn't get too fat, i.e. doesn't put on too much body condition. And this is because it appears that this is when the skeleton is most vulnerable to disease during those 6 months after weaning. So it's important at this stage to monitor body condition, monitor nutrition, and ensure that the skeleton gets the substrates it needs to grow. So there's a few different scenarios for feeding weanlings. Those that are wanting to have slow and steady growth, so possibly you breeders out there that are not breeding for sale and wanting to retain horses to race, you don't need them to be growing quite as rapidly as those that are prepping for early sale. These are what we call slow and steady growth. Ideally, if you've got great pasture, that's ideal. If you have, you can then balance those deficiencies in the pasture off with a balancer pellet, a low intake, concentrated pellet or feed per day. Poor pasture will have to provide some supplementary hay and a breeding feed. I'm obviously unsure or unfamiliar with the feeds that you have in your area, so it's important to have a nutrition analysis or a qualified nutritionist give you some diet advice so that you're getting exactly what you need based on what your property provides your horses in terms of your pasture. Those that are prepping for shows, whether it's for sale, whether it's weanling or yearling, you'll need to provide quality forage and then a quality breeding feed or concentrate, depending on the condition of the horse. So again, tailor it for your environment. So speak to a nutritionist. As I mentioned in my introduction, it wouldn't be a growth talk without talking about developmental orthopedic disease. And essentially, DOD, or developmental orthopedic disease, is an umbrella term that is used to describe a group of diseases that affect the bones and cartilage of young growing horses. Most of us have had experience with them on the breeding farm. It almost goes without saying. And in fact, the general statistics are that about 10% of horses born will have some issue with bone or joint disease. It's a really big problem in horses that are growing rapidly. But anyway, the diseases that are under this umbrella are things like fasciitis or epiphysitis, osteochondritis dissecans or OCD, wobbler syndrome, angular limb deformities, etc. Fasciitis is a condition that actually affects the growth plate of young growing bones, and it's one that is a problem if it causes the inflammation, the swelling around the time of sale. It's not particularly it's not very sightly, but what we do know with fasciitis is, assuming that no growth plate damage has happened, these horses generally do recover once the growth plate is closed off. So it can happen generally with young foals and weanlings. You see fasciitis down in the lower limbs, around where I've circled with this foal, down in the ankles or fetlocks. You can see here, this image is showing some swelling in that fetlock of a young foal with fasciitis. And then as the horse grows older, those growth plates will have closed off. This is a yearling with quite significant fasciitis in the distal carpus or the knee. And again, this is pretty major, but provided you feed the horse with lowering its energy so it doesn't gain a huge amount of condition on top of that inflamed growth, restrict exercise if they're lame. Generally, once those growth plates heal and close over, that doesn't become a problem anymore. The one that does become a problem is the OCD, or osteochondritis dissecans. And this is a situation in which there's a disturbance in the cartilage of a joint, or the articular cartilage within a joint, and this causes a lesion or a cyst, and can happen in multiple joints. From the fetlock, hock, stifle are the main joints that this occurs in. It's diagnosed through lameness, swelling, radiograph, and that's probably the most common reason for a yearling or a thoroughbred to fail its pre-sale radiographs. Sometimes surgery can be helpful, depending on how severe the lesion is. Sometimes it can't be. So what factors contribute to developmental orthopedic diseases? Well, certainly nutrition is a main one, but it's not the only one. Genetics have a big part to play, the environment that the animal's in, the management of the growth of that animal, any injury or stress that occurs during growth, and certainly you've got young colts hooning around a paddock fighting each other. That can cause a lot of stress on those joints. We do know that there is an influence of size of horses on skeletal problems. So this has been proven over many years in lots of studies. This is just an example of one study that we've done recently, looking at yearlings raised in a commercial situation. We had survey radiographs, so in the winter and spring of their yearling year, had about a 16% incidence of OCD and some sesamoiditis as well. We know that in this survey radiographs, the heavier and the taller foals had a greater incidence of OCD, and that's because they've got extra condition on those joints generally. We also know that irregular growth rates can influence cartilage and bone development. So periods of slow growth followed by rapid catch-up or compensatory growth is not good for young growing joints. So you can see here it's important to spot these anomalies early. So should the pasture drop off and we don't provide them with supplementary forage in a timely period, you'll see that average daily gains drop off. And then if you try and catch up, that's not great to suddenly overload those joints with a lot excess body condition. So this window of vulnerability is really important during that 6 to 12 months of age. And that's when if these sort of zigzags in growth happen, is when we run into problems. Now, nutrition does have a big part to play in developmental orthopedic disease, specifically with relation to vitamin and mineral balance, as well as calories, energy intake. Mineral deficiencies or excesses can have a big problem. So some of the main ones that we consider are those that are designed for or required for bone and cartilage development. So your big ones such as calcium and phosphorus, which we all know about, and your trace minerals, copper and zinc, they're pretty important. We know that horses can tolerate pretty high levels, and certainly, but if we get very, very high and very out of balance, we can run into problems with secondary mineral deficiency because there's an interaction between the absorption of these minerals. So often we recommend that you use a nutritionist to balance your mineral nutrition for your horses. Don't try and do it based on what you think they might need, or savvy marketing by supplement companies. Another issue that we run into with young horses in terms of their nutrition is breeders choosing the wrong grain or concentrate feed for their young stock. So common scenarios that we see where breeders will run into problems are feeding a feed that's not designed for breeding or growing horses. So a feed for a performance horse or a mature horse often doesn't have the right amount of amino acids or vitamins and minerals in the formulation. Furthermore, feeding straight cereal grains such as oats or corn with no additional vitamin minerals. These feeds provide some pretty good energy, but not good trace mineral nutrition. Also, people that run into problems where they might feed half the recommended amount of a feed that's been designed to be fed at a certain level. You feed that less because the horse doesn't need so much condition, and you run into not feeding enough vitamins and minerals. Also, diluting feed with grain can be a problem if it hasn't been formulated. So these can be corrected by feeding the most appropriate choice of feed for your situation. Mineral balance is vital too. The main ones would be calcium and phosphorus. You need to have the right balance of calcium and phosphorus, ideally 1.5% calcium, 1.5 calciums to 1 phosphorus. Zinc and copper should be around 4 to 1. Now, the best method of diagnosing whether there's a nutrition problem on the property or whether there's deficiencies or excesses or whether you're doing the right thing is through a ration evaluation. A lot of people will rely on blood analysis, hair and hoof analysis. There's laboratories which take hair samples and tell you whether you're deficient in various minerals. And we don't believe that there's hugely credible or useful in determining whether there's a nutritional deficiency because, of course, there's not a huge amount of a lot of these nutrients stored in hair. They might be in the bone, for example, or they're not circulating around the blood when a blood sample is taken. So it's important to look at what the horse is being fed and then see whether there's any gaps. So how do we manage our feeding to prevent developmental orthopedic diseases? Well, one of the big things with feeding management is overfeeding. People want large, well-grown horses, and so the thought is that you feed them as much as they can possibly eat. But of course, rapid growth rates, particularly body fat gain, is a factor that overloads these young joints and causes these developmental problems. We know that larger foals with bigger joints, bigger bones are more likely to develop these OCD lesions across many breeds. We know that OCDs that occur up high in the hock and the stifle tend to occur in these heavier horses. So it's thought that these biomechanical forces from excess condition is involved in this. We also recommend, therefore, not to overfeed horses. So there's no simple rule about how much is too much, because we obviously want to treat each horse as an individual, which is very tricky when you've got bands of young horses running out, 10 to 12 horses in a group, that you want to feed them the same amount. It's important to obviously monitor them and look at them and try and get them into as streamlined group as possible. Obviously, what forage you have available on your property and what hay you might be able to provide them will dictate what grain or concentrate feed you feed. Sometimes it might be a good idea, if you've got really good hay, not to even feed a huge amount of feed, and just a ration balancer is great to just top up what's missing. But again, we recommend to regularly weigh and body condition score your young horses. And ideally, we'd like to see a couple of ribs. A lot of especially in that weaning to yearling phase, a lot of the time they do look like this. They develop little potty weanling bellies, and provided that's not a worming issue, we don't actually mind seeing the odd rib or two. So it's really important to resist the temptation to fill them up full of feed, have them with round apple bottoms and a big groove down their back. They don't need that excess condition. Provided you're feeding them a balanced diet with the right vitamin and mineral and protein to grow bone and cartilage, they don't need excess weight. Hopefully, we know that high protein intake is not a factor in relation to developmental orthopedic disease. However, there are still some trains of thought out there that protein causes developmental problems in the skeleton. And this has been well disproven with a lot of work that's shown that quality protein is vital for good, sound growth. This particular example here is a study that was done by Kate Savage and her team that looked at feeding high levels of energy versus high levels of protein in a diet. And they found that horses that were in the high energy or high calorie diet had multiple OCD lesions as weanlings, and those in the high protein diet, there was only one horse that developed OCD lesions. So it was shown that 130% of protein requirement, which you would never feed, because it's way too much anyway, didn't have an influence on OCD lesions, whereas up to 130% of calories did show an increase in the incidence of OCD. Now, it's thought that calories does obviously lead to rapid weight gain, increased incidence of OCD, but how these calories are provided to the foal may actually have an influence on bone development. And it's thought that hyperglycemia or hyperinsulinemia, so a rapid increase in blood glucose or blood insulin, is implicated in the pathogenesis of some of these joint diseases. So KER did a study looking at the relationship between glycemic response, or how rapidly or how the response from blood glucose and then subsequent insulin in weanling thoroughbreds fed different diets depending on how much sugar and starch was in that diet. So the study looked at thoroughbreds again on breeding farms in Kentucky. They were fed a known amount of non-structural carbohydrate or sugar and starch, and blood glucose and insulin was measured. And then they went on to look at the incidence of joint disease. And what they found was, in the population as a whole, they had on average about 11 to 12% of horses had OCD lesions. They were routinely, diagnosed through X-ray during pre-sales X-rays. But what was most interesting was that the plasma glucose and insulin response to a meal was higher in the weanlings that went on to get OCD than those that didn't. And so it was thought that this high glucose and insulin response was associated with an increase in OCD. Now that meant that these foals that had this high increase in glucose after they ate the meal went on to have greater incidence of OCD. These foals were also larger. So, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I've just pressed the wrong button. Right, there we go. So what we found was that foals with this extreme glycemic response, so they ate a meal, their blood sugar shot up, their blood insulin went up, had an atypical incidence of OCD. So it shows that glycemic index of the feed is a possible factor in the pathogenesis of DOD. So what we recommend is that based on the results of this study, that breeding feeds and that young horses fed breeding feeds are fed concentrates that don't have a high glycemic response. So those that are higher in fiber and fat or oils and less reliance on grains such as oats, maize or corn and barley. So how do we reduce the risk of developmental orthopedic disease? Well, obviously broodmare nutrition is pretty important, making sure that the young horse is provided with those minerals for bone development while they're in utero, monitoring growth rates when they're born, balanced nutrition during growth, so have a nutrition analysis done and make sure that they have slow and steady growth, and feeding a low glycemic feed. Once the horse is a yearling and it reaches 12 months of age, it's less likely to develop a new disease under the DOD umbrella. And if there's a lesion that's clinically relevant during X-ray for sale, they're usually typically formed at a younger age, whether or not they show clinical signs or not. So again, it's important not to overdo these young horses. Nutrient balance is really important. And if there is a clinical or an evidence of an OCD present, it's important again to monitor the amount of exercise that horse has to prevent lameness. So the considerations when we're feeding yearlings are that young growing colts may need more calories than fillies to maintain their condition. Often fillies tend to get a wee bit fat, whereas colts do have a higher energy or calorie demand. If you have good spring pasture, be careful not to overfeed their supplementary feed on that. Spring pasture and pasture growing through into the summer can provide really good levels of calories and protein. So often horses manage to maintain weight very well on good pasture. They might just need a balancer pellet. If we're prepping for sale, calorie intake will probably need to be increased, but monitor body condition scores so they don't get too fat. So introducing a quality roughage source such as alfalfa, which we call lucerne in the Southern Hemisphere. Sorry, I didn't change that slide. And also a breeding feed that contains good amounts of oil, beet pulp, which is a fabulous fiber source for calories, and also things like stabilized rice bran for conditioning. Maximising bone development's pretty important. Obviously, when I said when they were born, they've only got 17% of their mature bone mineral content. And mature bone mineral content is not actually achieved till they're 6 years of age. So we want our horses to perform at pretty high levels and pretty fast speeds much, much earlier than this. So we need to make sure that skeleton is growing as well as possible. They need calories, they need protein, they need vitamins and minerals to grow that skeleton properly. We also know that exercise has a massive factor on bone development. Free choice exercise, and when a horse is asked to perform a forced exercise, increases bone mass in young horses. And this has been shown in multiple breeds. We know that weanlings that have undergone forced exercise up to yearling age had increased cannon bone size compared with those that weren't exercised. We know that horses, some work that I was involved at in New Zealand showed controlled sprint exercise of young thoroughbred horses had increased bone size and development as well, which persisted through to racing if they were forced to be exercised as a young weanling. KER, or Kentucky Equine Research, has also been looking at bone development in young horses, because one of the main causes of wastage, of course, in these horses once they hit the racetrack is catastrophic bone injury. but also things like shin soreness or shin splints is a big one, which is related to bone mineral density as well. This particular study looked at weanlings or young horses. We measured their bone mineral content in breeding farms in Kentucky over a year, and found that, interestingly, their bone mineral increased as they got older, but it decreased in the winter months, which could be related to less exercise. Daylight might have been a factor there, but we know that these horses decreased their bone mineral density during winter and increased again in spring. We continued the study to see whether we could feed a supplement which might attenuate this drop in bone mineral density. And so this particular supplement was developed. It's called triactin, where we measured the bone mineral of these young horses routinely. Half the group was fed triactin, the other half was not. They were on a balanced diet otherwise. And we looked at various measures of bone mineral content. This particular view is the dorsal palmar view, which is from the front of the cannon bone. We also looked at the lateral medial view, which is an X-ray taken from the side, looking into the medial aspect of the horse's leg. And what we found was some very interesting results as well. We saw that there was a change in the medullary density, or the density of the bone, from the lateral medial view between the treatments. So we found that horses that were not fed this bone supplement had a drop in bone mineral density during those winter months. Those that were supplemented with this particular supplement had an increase in bone mineral content. So we found that we were able to build bone essentially in these weanlings. And I haven't got the data here, but the bone supplement was fed to performance horses during race training. And again, we found increases in bone mineral content in these horses, which is pretty significant considering no other supplement has been scientifically proven to increase bone mineral content in thoroughbreds. So in conclusion, there's quite a lot of information presented today, and I do want to say that we've got all of this information available on our Kentucky Equine Research website. So if you did want to find some further information, it is all available there. But the summary from this talk is that we know that slow and steady growth is important for skeletal soundness. We want to grow that skeleton to the best it can be without causing these young horses to get too fat or gaining too much body condition on that growing skeleton. So therefore, we recommend that the young equine athlete is monitored very carefully during that growth period. Adjusting calories or energy intake is important. Do not overfeed these young horses. A couple of ribs are okay to be seen during that weaning, weanling to yearling phase. As with all horses, it's important to build the diet from a forage base. Good quality forage first should always be the basis of a breeding program, and then you top up the gaps with a specially formulated concentrate feed. Remember that quality protein with good levels of amino acids are important for growing young horses. Don't shy away from protein. It does not influence developmental orthopedic disease. Balanced vitamin and mineral intake is vital. This starts off when the foal is in utero within the mare's belly. Make sure that mare is fed properly, particularly in the last trimester of pregnancy. And it would be prudent to choose low glycemic energy sources. So for young growing horses, feeds that are formulated to have less grain and sugar, so less molasses, less oats, less corn, and more fat and fiber would be a wise decision when you're growing and your young horses and formulating their diets. I'd also just like to draw your attention to some of the equine nutrition resources we have available for everybody. We have a newsletter that we present a lot of our latest research that comes to you if you sign up for it. And that's from our education site called Equinews. So I invite you to sign up to the Equinews newsletter. And if you do want your diets analysed on your thoroughbred farm, whether you'd like your pasture assessed and hay assessed, and then a suitable concentrate to balance that up, we can certainly help you with that. So I invite you to get in touch with us at Kentucky Equine Research. And thank you very much. And I'd like to invite any questions.
Thank you very much, Clarissa. Awesome information. I know I was trying to write down any takeaways that are great. So again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to write them down in the Q&A portion. We do have a few coming in from Facebook Live as well. One of our first questions from an anonymous attendee says, please guide about portion of about portions of balanced rations of yearlings and adult horses. Also, please advise about micronutrients and macronutrient quantity for rations.
Excellent. Well, that's a very big question and probably a talk in itself about how one balances the ration of yearlings and adult horses. Essentially, what I would do if I was presented with that question with a breeder, I would look at the forage portion of the diet. So I would look at what pasture that horse is getting and what supplementary hay that horse is getting, and then look at how much ration that horse requires. It may be that the quality of the pasture and hay is very high, and so the ration portion of the diet could be very small. So you may only need a couple of pounds of a balancer to balance that out. They may need 6 or 7 pounds of a full breeding feed, depending on what's available. So that is quite tricky in terms of answering that without knowing the situation. In terms of micro and macronutrients, again, these feeds, breeding feeds across the board, regardless of what company you use or feed manufacturer you use, ideally, these macro and micronutrients in the feed have been formulated to meet requirements for the specific horse being fed. So the quantity of calcium and phosphorus, magnesium, zinc, copper, iodine, selenium, etc., does come down to a balance that we know is applicable to young horses. And we usually do this based on NRC guidelines. NRC is the National Research Council, which essentially collates all the research related to nutrition and says, well, a horse that's 12 months of age needs X grams of copper per day. And so based on those numbers is how we formulate feeds. Hopefully that's answered your question, but again, that's why we often recommend going to a qualified nutritionist to get your diets done, instead of going to the feed store and buying some copper sulfate and some sulfur and some magnesium and trying to do it yourself. It's better to go with the experts.
Definitely. That is very good advice. Fernando asks, in the study talking about glycemic and insulin response, the foals were the foals under a specific exercise routine? Do you think that exercise could improve the insulin response and lower the chances of OCD?
That's a really good question, because we certainly know that exercise does improve insulin response, and certainly with metabolic horses, we always recommend, if they're not lame, to exercise them to improve that response. It's interesting. These young foals in the study were raised in a commercial situation. So they were on a thoroughbred farm. They had turnout. I'm assuming they were boxed at some period of time, but they weren't under a specific exercise routine where they were forced exercise. They might have been on a walker. I'm not entirely sure, but it's a really good question. I think the main take-home point from that study was a large glucose and insulin response didn't necessarily cause that OCD, but the particular foals that had an abnormal glucose response to that feed, because remember, they were all fed the same feed, those that showed that increase in extreme glucose response went on to have a higher incidence of OCD. So it's not necessarily a causation. It's just that we wouldn't recommend that everyone have their young horses undergo a glucose response test, see what their glucose tolerance was, and then choose the feed based on that. We would do more of an umbrella approach and say, well, based on this data, a lower glycemic feed might be a good idea across the board, regardless of how your horse responds to it, glucose wise. But yes, exercise may well have an effect. Sorry, that was very convoluted.
From Facebook, my foals are constantly eating dirt, manure, even their mother's tails. Are they missing something in their diet?
Oh, those naughty babies, especially the mother's tails. That's really frustrating. Look, interestingly, eating dirt or eating manure, a lot of the times people say the horse is looking for some nutrient or seeking out some nutrient. And there's only two nutrients that this may be the case for, and that's sodium and chloride, where they might be looking, which is of course salt. Eating dirt and eating manure and tails may actually be an issue where they're looking to, it depends on the age of the foal. Eating manure, they might be looking to populate their gut with bacteria. They may be looking for a fiber source, especially if they're eating the tail. So I would look at how much fiber is being provided in that diet. If they're extremely young and they're eating manure, that's a normal thing to do because they look at populating the gut with the right bacteria. And if they're eating dirt, I would look at whether they are getting enough salt in their diet if they're a wee bit older. So there's things that might be missing, but they're not going to be sitting there eating dirt going, my body feels like it needs some copper today, so I'm going to eat this dirt in case it has copper in it. They're not that clever. They don't do that. They will look for salt though, which is why a salt block situation in a paddock can work. Katie may want to add to that.
Yeah, I did. Another thing to keep in mind is sometimes it's just a boredom issue, and these babies have energy, and for whatever reason, chewing on mama's tail is fun and interesting. Eating dirt, chewing wood, many of those are just boredom issues. Yeah. As Clarissa said, the coprophagy, eating the manure, is a very natural behavior in horses. You see it pretty often in the youngsters. It tends to drop off in the older horses, but you sometimes see adult horses eating manure. And again, sometimes it's just they're bored, and that's just something interesting to do.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie.
We have another question. Is vitamin D important to supplement in growing foals? Or is it difficult to find, and I am going to butcher this word, hypovitaminosis D, because sun exposure is enough?
Vitamin D is really important for bone development in young horses. And again, it probably depends on where you are about how much sun exposure they're getting, but generally that's okay. We do formulate feeds and breeding feeds with vitamin D in it to ensure that they're getting enough for bone development. In terms of sun exposure being, look, it is important, basically. Katie, do you want to add anything to that in terms of D specifically?
There has been a little bit more interest in vitamin D in the States in the past few years. I think one of the reasons is because there are babies born in January, February and kept inside, and they don't get a whole lot of sun exposure. So again, the feeds are formulated with vitamin D to meet requirements. You don't see a lot of vitamin D deficiencies that are obvious, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. The big thing with vitamin D is the fat soluble vitamins often can be toxic if you start going to town on supplementing. The amounts in the balanced feeds are not so high that you're going to run into overdoses, basically. But if you start worrying about it and supplementing, especially vitamins A and D, those can be problematic. So if you get a good balanced feed, feed to recommendation, and your horses get outside, you should be fine on vitamin D.
And Carol asks, what are your recommendations for orphan foals to best transition them to solids?
Orphan Foals. Sorry that I took that out. I shouldn't have. Look, orphan foals are tricky. If they're obviously orphaned at birth, it's really horrible situation for everybody. And I know that those of you who are not based at large multinational studs probably don't have a herd of nurse mares available to you to grab and stick your foal onto. Although I know there's quite a lot of good broodmare resources to find these nurse mares. However, if orphan at birth, we recommend that colostrum's tubed before starting a milk replacer. Some studs will choose to give plasma as well. When we've done some work looking at starting them on equine milk replacer and have found we can get young babies drinking out of a bucket pretty easily by filling the bucket with a very, very small amount of milk replacer in the bottom. The foal's nose is able to touch the bottom of the bucket, and that teaches them to drink without having to worry about the fuss of a bottle, which is quite good. We would recommend that they start nibbling and having access, obviously, to pasture and to a really gentle creep feed quite early on. They can develop the ability to eat this grain, and within a few weeks, to allow them to have access to it. One of the big things is you can wean them earlier than horses on the mares, because it's a hassle to have to mix so much milk up. So, at 10 to 12 weeks, even a little bit younger, they must be accustomed to hard feed. And so you can get them onto hard feed very early. But there are some orphan foal feeds on the market. And certainly, again, volume is important. So a more concentrated balancer may be a better feed for these young guys, provided they're eating enough fiber.
Okay. And how do you recommend feeding foals with contracted tendons, down pastures, or windswept foals?
Alrighty, these angular limb deformities are problematic in that if the horse is carrying too much condition or exercising with too much force, particularly depending on the severity of these deformities, you can run into problems where the joints are obviously overloaded in an imbalanced way. Ideally, with these angular limb deformities, we would look at ensuring that the vitamin, mineral, and protein intake were recommended for that age of animal, but the calorie intake was dropped off to about 50 to 70% of what's recommended. So ideally, keeping vitamin, mineral, protein at 100% of recommended for that particular horse, but calorie drop the calories off. And that is so that the animal's able to provide the substrates for growing the bone and cartilage, but not put on too much body condition, so that those, whatever influence you're doing, whether you're splinting them, whether they're having to undergo surgery, or just restricted exercise so that those things tighten up or straighten up on their own. You don't want them carrying too much condition on those joints, which are not straight.
Another thing
I just think for those cases that individually I would be getting a nutritionist to examine how severe they are in terms of how much you back off that calorie intake.
And one of the main reasons to take the calorie intake down is there's pretty good data that indicates the increase in calories increases the growth rate. So when you back off on calories, you're slowing down the growth rate and then providing all the essential nutrients for good, healthy growth without putting on too much height too quickly. So you want a nice, smooth growth curve, but when you're running into problems, you want to lower that curve so it's a slower growth rate to let those babies get a chance to get some good, healthy growth and hopefully address some of those problems.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions. Dr. Young, as the American-based expert tonight, could you recommend appropriate feeds for young horses that are available in the United States, most specifically probably the Midwest and Indiana?
Well, and that's a great question. And I got to say, there's quite a few good feeds available to y'all in the Midwest. I would recommend that you go looking for a feed that is formulated by Kentucky Equine Research. And there are several feeds, several brands you're probably familiar with. Hallway, OBS, Legends, all are available in your area. You can always contact KER, which I love. The website is so easy to remember, KER.com. You can contact KER and talk to an advisor, because of course the folks are located right in Versailles, Kentucky, and know everybody that's selling feed that's formulated by KER available in your area.
Definitely. You guys are never slow to help, and I think that's great. We've got just a couple more questions and we'll wrap up. How often would you recommend weaning growing foals? And I believe that Dr. Brown-Douglas addressed that towards the beginning, but just a quick reminder, Dr. Brown-Douglas, how often would you recommend weaning foals?
Well, ideally, I would recommend weighing at birth, so you have a birth weight to go on, and then every 30 days, so once a month. Ideally, that works out quite well in terms of when one might be bringing their young horses in for routine farrier, for example. So that's turned out to be quite a good period of time. There's some really keen breeders that weigh every week. And then I think that the closer together you weigh, the more wiggle you get in your growth curve. And so once a month's pretty good to show you how they're growing. But of course, always keeping an eye on condition score. That's something that's really easy, making sure they don't get too fat, making sure you know how many ribs you can feel. Do that every time you go and view them and check them out. So yeah, every 30 days is what we recommend.
And Carol, who had the question about orphan foals, she has a follow-up that I think is really interesting. She says, pro-elite growth for the orphan, would you add beet pulp or some other supplement to encourage them to eat? Or would you prefer the Legends growth formula? I work for Southern states and have a thoroughbred breeder client with an orphan that we've been working with. She's losing interest in her formula and she is a bucket drinker.
Katie, you will know those a lot better than
Quite
I
honest,
would.
yeah, I'd have to go in and take a look at those specific products to be able to really give a good answer to that. That's something I think would best be answered individually if we can take it, offline, and that would be a great one for one of the advisors in Kentucky to take a look at and run a quick balance and provide the best answer there.
But certainly beet pulp is very palatable, and that's absolutely fine to add that if the foal wants to eat it. It sort of depends on also how old the foal is as well.
Right.
Definitely. And you guys can always email Kentucky Equine Research. In the United States, the corporate office's email is info@ker.com. Or we do have a couple people that are tuning in from Australia. And so if you have questions out that way, you can email advice@ker.com. And I have one last question to wrap things up. In your data, Clarissa, do you see a big difference in the size of foals from specific bloodlines?
Well, interestingly, in fact, again, not included in this, and I think we're still in the process of putting the paper together, and there's also some confidentiality issues, but we have been looking at different sire lines and the size of these horses. So yes, we have definitely seen some differences in general body size and growth rates depending on the bloodlines. And I think that would be a really interesting follow-up, and we're just trying to get the paper together where we don't necessarily identify the sires, but we're able to say, sire A, B, and C. It's really tricky when we're working with these big studs, big thoroughbred studs and bloodlines and awful lot of money on the cards. when we're crunching these numbers to keep some level of confidentiality. But yes, there's definitely bloodline differences. And generally, I think if you're in the industry, you do tend to go, oh, well, so-and-so tends to throw X, Y, and Z. And if we have a mare from this particular bloodline, she always has big babies, that sort of thing. So yes, there's definitely a bloodline / genetics effect on size. Where we run into trouble is then when we link that to joint disease. That's when we really don't want to be, spouting about which bloodline does what.
Exactly. Thank you guys very much for tuning in to tonight's webinar. Dr. Young, did you have anything else to add?
No, I think Clarissa covered everything very well. Again, I just want to remind folks that Kentucky Equine Research, we're more than happy to help you figure out the best way to feed your horses for optimal growth. So please feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to help.
Yeah, and also I mentioned the GrowTrack weighing program, and that's available to breeders to use. It doesn't cost anything, and it's a software program that if you're interested in using, it's really simple to use, and it's a really great way of tracking the body weights of your horses. You also don't need to have an electronic scale to use it. We have breeders that don't have scales, and they use a weight tape to get an idea of how their horses are growing. So if you want to have access to GrowTrack, get in touch with us at Kentucky Equine Research, and we're happy to provide that to you.
Yes, definitely. I actually went ahead and shared the link to the information
from
KER's website on the chat, and we will share it on our Facebook page as well. For anybody that's kind of just tuning in, it's KER.com/tools/GRO-TRAC. So thank you guys very much. Thank you, Dr. Brown-Douglas. Thank you, Dr. Young, for tuning in. This is the second in our little series of nutritional webinars that we did in partnership with Kentucky Equine Research. This has been recorded, and we will have it available for on demand on the Indiana Thoroughbred Alliance's YouTube channel. And we have, along with, we also have Dr. Peter Huntington's webinar that was on feeding the brood mare all year round, as well as our webinar that we had earlier this month, actually, on harnessing the power of group ownership in horse racing. So just go to youtube.com and search Indiana Thoroughbred Alliance. We want to thank Kentucky Equine Research once again for being great educational partners. Thank you, Clarissa. Thank you, Katie. And thanks to everybody who has tuned in. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your evening, and best of luck out there at the tracks.
Thank you.
Thank you.